The men inside Stirling Castle had already decided to surrender when King Edward VI of England gave the order that transformed a military victory into one of the most chilling demonstrations of power in medieval Britain. For nearly 3 months, the small Scottish garrison had watched stones, burning missiles, and fragments of shattered masonry fall around them. They had endured the pounding of English siege engines by day and by night. They had guarded weakening walls, counted their supplies, buried their fears, and searched the countryside for the army that never came to rescue them. Now, below the castle's volcanic rock, Edward's carpenters were completing something larger than any of the machines that had already attacked them. Massive wooden beams rose above the crowded English camp. Ropes as thick as a man's arm hung beside a towering throwing arm. Winches, iron fittings, slings, and an enormous counterweight formed a machine whose purpose could be understood even before it moved. The defenders knew that the weapon was intended to break the walls that had protected them. Their commander, Sir William Oliphant, offered to surrender. Under ordinary circumstances, that should have ended the siege. Edward had demanded the castle, and the castle was being offered to him. No more men needed to die. No more stone needed to fall. But Edward refused to accept the surrender. He had spent too much money, gathered too many materials, and summoned too many witnesses. His new machine had not yet been fired. The king did not merely want to possess Stirling Castle. He wanted Scotland to see what happened when anyone resisted him. The weapon waiting below the walls was called the Warwolf, and before the siege ended, Edward intended to release it. To understand why a king would reject the surrender he had spent months trying to obtain, it is necessary to understand the fortress standing above him. Stirling Castle occupied a steep volcanic crag overlooking the River Forth and the Roots that connected the Scottish lowlands with the lands farther north. The castle visible today contains magnificent buildings constructed long after Edward's siege, but the strength of the position was already ancient. From the rock, guards could watch roads, river crossings, farms, and movements across a wide sweep of country. An army advancing through central Scotland could not easily ignore Stirling. The place was both gateway and barrier, a stronghold from which rulers could influence, travel between regions, and protect the heart of the kingdom. It was also a royal symbol. Scottish kings had valued the site for generations, and the flag raised above its walls represented more than the survival of a few soldiers. In 1304, Stirling was one of the final visible signs that Edward had not completely extinguished resistance to English rule. Almost every great noble who had opposed him had submitted or negotiated terms. William Wallace remained in hiding, but he no longer commanded an army capable of confronting Edward in open battle. Across Scotland, men who had once carried weapons against the English king were trying to preserve their lands, families, and titles by accepting his authority. Yet the lion rampant still flew above Stirling Castle. To Edward, it was not merely a flag, it was an accusation. It told everyone who could see it that the Scottish crown had not vanished and that the English conquest was not complete. Edward I was not a young or inexperienced ruler when he came to Stirling. He had been King of England since 1272 and had spent much of his reign turning royal ambition into organized military power. He was tall, physically imposing, disciplined, and often relentless. He understood that victory depended on far more than courage in battle. Armies required money, food, horses, roads, ships, craftsmen, clerks, and the authority to command all of them. During his wars in Wales, Edward had ordered the construction of a chain of great castles, designed not only to hold territory but also to display permanent domination. Stone walls, fortified gates, and royal garrisons became instruments of government. He learned that architecture could frighten enemies long after soldiers had marched away. He also learned the value of engineers. A strong castle could delay an army for months, but a ruler who possessed skilled builders, reliable supply lines, and sufficient wealth could surround that castle with an industry dedicated to its destruction. Edward approached warfare as an immense royal project. When he wanted a fortress built, forests were cut, quarries were opened, laborers were summoned, and money flowed through the hands of officials. When he wanted a fortress destroyed, the same system worked in reverse. Carpenters built engines instead of roofs. Smiths forged brackets instead of gates. Wagons carried stones to be thrown rather than stones to be placed in walls. When he wanted a fortress built, forests were cut, quarries were opened, laborers were summoned, and money flowed through the hands of officials. When he wanted a fortress destroyed, the same system worked in reverse. Carpenters built engines instead of roofs. Smiths forged brackets instead of gates. Wagons carried stones to be thrown rather than stones to be placed in walls. At Stirling, the full machinery of Edward's monarchy gathered around a garrison of only about 25 men. The road to that confrontation had begun years earlier with a crisis in the Scottish succession. King Alexander III of Scotland died in 1286, leaving no surviving son. His young granddaughter Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, became the heir, but she died in 1290 before she could be crowned. Scotland was left without an undisputed monarch, and several powerful families presented competing claims. The Scottish guardians invited Edward to help judge the succession, believing that his authority might prevent civil war. Edward agreed, but he demanded recognition as Lord Superior of Scotland. The decision placed the kingdom in a dangerous position. John Balliol was eventually selected as king, yet Edward treated him less like an independent monarch than a subordinate. English demands, legal appeals, and political pressure weakened Balliol's authority. When conflict with France drew England toward war, the Scottish leadership resisted Edward's commands and formed an alliance with the French. In 1296, Edward invaded Scotland. Berwick was captured in a terrible assault. Scottish forces were defeated at Dunbar. John Balliol was stripped of his kingship, and Edward carried away the Stone of Destiny, the ancient symbol used in Scottish coronations. To the English king, Scotland appeared conquered, but occupation created resistance. The most famous early leader of that resistance was William Wallace. In 1297, Wallace and Andrew Moray led Scottish forces to victory at Stirling Bridge, where the English army attempted to cross the River Forth in a vulnerable column. The victory shocked Edward's government and demonstrated that conquest could be challenged. The following year, Edward personally led a campaign north and defeated Wallace at Falkirk. English longbowmen and disciplined forces broke the Scottish formation, but the victory did not end the war. Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland, and other nobles continued the struggle through shifting alliances, raids, negotiations, and sieges. The conflict was never as simple as one united nation fighting another. Scottish lords had rivalries, divided loyalties, family interests, and estates that could be confiscated or restored. Some fought Edward, submitted, rebelled again, or cooperated with him when survival demanded it. Robert the Bruce, who would later become Scotland's most celebrated warrior king, moved through this dangerous political world long before openly claiming the crown. By early 1304, however, Edward had regained the advantage. Many Scottish leaders accepted terms that returned their lands in exchange for obedience. Wallace was isolated. The organized resistance appeared close to collapse. Stirling Castle remained. The governor of the castle, Sir William Oliphant, commanded a garrison so small that every able man mattered. About 25 defenders could not hope to defeat Edward's field army outside the walls. They could not charge down the rock, scatter thousands of soldiers, and ride away to freedom. Their weapon was the fortress itself. Thick masonry, elevation, narrow approaches, and stored provisions allowed a few men to resist a much larger force. Inside, daily life would have been defined by repetition and uncertainty. Guards watched from the battlements, while others repaired damage, carried water, prepared food, and checked weapons. Salted beef remained in the stores, giving the men the means to continue, longer than Edward may have expected. They listened for the sounds of construction below and studied every change in the enemy camp. At night, fires marked the positions of English tents. By morning, more carts arrived. The defenders knew that most of the Scottish nobility had submitted. They knew that relief from France or from a surviving Scottish army was unlikely to appear in time. Yet surrender without permission could be interpreted as betrayal. Oliphant attempted to delay the inevitable by requesting permission to send a messenger to John de Saulles, the Guardian of Scotland, who was then in France. Edward denied the request. He had no intention of allowing a distant authority to prolong the resistance of the last important stronghold. Before Edward reached Stirling, he had already begun turning the siege into a demonstration of control over the country he claimed to rule. Scottish earls and lords who had submitted were ordered to provide men and horses. They were also commanded to prevent their people from carrying supplies to the garrison. This was politically useful as well as militarily practical. Edward forced former enemies to assist in the destruction of Scottish resistance, making them participants in his conquest. Men who might once have ridden to Stirling as defenders now had to support the army surrounding it. The king also demanded materials on a remarkable scale. Timber and components for siege engines came from Newcastle. Iron and great stones were collected. Churches in Scotland were ordered to strip lead from their roofs and send it to Stirling. Carts arrived from Brecon, Dunfermline, and St. Andrews, carrying the heavy metal needed by the English engineers. The removal of church roofing showed how completely military necessity could overwhelm ordinary life. Sacred buildings lost their protection from the weather, so that a royal army could attack a castle. Every cart rolling toward Stirling carried the same message Edward could reach into towns, estates, and churches, take what he required, and concentrate it against anyone who remained defiant. By the time Edward arrived on April 22, 1304, the ground below the castle was becoming a temporary city of war. Royal tents stood among workshops, storage areas, animal lines, kitchens, and guarded roads. Clerks recorded payments and deliveries. Priests served the spiritual needs of the army. Cooks prepared food for soldiers and laborers. Grooms cared for horses exhausted by travel and hauling. Blacksmiths repaired tools, shaped metal fittings, and replaced broken parts. Carpenters worked beneath shelters surrounded by timber, shavings, ropes, pegs, and beams. Teams of men moved stones selected for their size and shape. Soldiers protected the camp against raids that were now unlikely but never impossible. Scouts watched the countryside. Messengers carried orders between commanders, officials, and supply centers. A medieval siege was not simply an army standing outside a wall. It was a complex system that had to survive longer than the defenders. Food had to arrive before hunger weakened the attackers. Animals needed fodder. Machines needed maintenance. Sick and injured men had to be treated. Discipline had to be preserved while days became weeks. Edward's strength lay in his ability to maintain that system. The defenders saw only a fraction of the organization below them, but they understood its meaning. Their enemy could replace men, ropes, stones, and damaged equipment. They could replace almost nothing. Then the bombardment began. Edward assembled an extraordinary concentration of siege engines, including 13 catapults and trebuchets that hurled projectiles toward the castle day and night. The word catapult is often used loosely for several kinds of throwing machines, but the engines in Edward's camp would have differed in design and power. Some used twisted ropes or other forms of stored tension. Trebuchets used a long arm and a falling counterweight. Their crews did not simply point and fire with modern precision. They observed where each missile landed and adjusted the sling, release angle, counterweight, or position. The target was not always a single narrow point. Repeated heavy impacts could weaken a section of wall, damage towers, smash roofs, destroy defensive platforms, or make movement inside the castle dangerous. Stones were the most obvious ammunition, but siege forces could also throw burning material intended to start fires. Each launch created its own terrible rhythm. Men below loaded the sling. The engine was drawn down. A command was given. Ropes snapped tight, timber groaned, and the throwing arm surged upward. For an instant, the projectile was visible against the sky. Defenders shouted warnings and ran for cover. Then came the impact, sometimes against rock, sometimes inside the enclosure, sometimes directly against the castle's masonry. Dust filled passages. Fragments flew with enough force to wound men standing far from the point of impact. Roofs shook. Animals panicked. Fires demanded immediate attention. Every repair exposed the defenders to the next shot. The physical danger was only part of the assault. The machines were designed to attack confidence. A soldier behind a wall could not easily strike the engineers operating beyond bow range. He could only wait, listen, and wonder whether the next stone would hit the room in which he stood. Sleep became difficult because the bombardment continued through darkness. Even when an engine fell silent, the absence of sound could be more frightening than the noise. Silence might mean that the crew was repairing it, changing ammunition, moving it closer, or preparing a heavier missile. The garrison had to remain alert while exhaustion slowly reduced judgment and strength. Still, the castle held. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Edward watched as his great collection of engines battered Stirling without forcing an immediate surrender. The walls were damaged, but the defenders continued to raise their flag. The tiny garrison had salted meat and enough determination to endure. Their survival turned the siege into an embarrassment. Edward had gathered the resources of a kingdom against a few dozen men, yet the few dozen remained above him. Somewhere within the English camp, however, a different project was taking shape. 5 master carpenters and about 50 workmen were assembling massive beams, winches, ropes, and an enormous counterweight. They were not inventing the trebuchet. Counterweight trebuchets had been known in Europe and the eastern Mediterranean before Edward's reign, and medieval engineers understood the principles that made them powerful. What Edward commissioned at Stirling was an attempt to build one on an exceptional scale. The surviving evidence does not allow anyone to state its exact height or every detail of its appearance with certainty. Later, imaginations have sometimes turned it into a wooden tower of impossible dimensions. The truth is more impressive because it did not require fantasy. The machine had to be large enough to throw a massive stone, yet strong enough to survive the violent release of its own energy. A beam that bent too far could split. A joint that shifted could throw the arm out of alignment. A rope that failed could kill the crew. A frame that twisted under the falling counterweight could collapse into a forest of broken timber. The builders needed practical knowledge, careful measurement, strong materials, and the ability to coordinate scores of workers without modern cranes, engines, or steel cables. Imagine the work not as a sudden act of genius, but as a long sequence of demanding tasks. Trees had to be selected or previously prepared. Timber had to be transported. Beams were shaped with axes, adzes, and saws. Surfaces were cut so that joints met closely. Holes were bored. Wooden pegs and iron fittings locked parts together. Ropes were inspected for weakness. Winches were mounted where teams could operate them. The axle had to carry the throwing arm while allowing it to rotate freely. The counterweight box or mass had to be constructed so that gravity would pull the short end downward with immense force. The sling at the long end needed the correct length. Too short, and the stone would leave at the wrong angle. Too long, and it might strike the ground, fly too high, or threaten the camp. Every component affected every other component. The machine was a system, and the system had only one purpose: to convert the slow labor of men into a few seconds of destructive motion. The defenders could watch the Warwolf rise. That was part of its power. A sword could remain hidden in a scabbard until the moment of attack. This machine announced itself for weeks. Each new beam added to the frame warned the men above that the weapons already pounding them were not Edward's final answer. Hammer blows drifted up the rock. Teams pulled ropes. Wagons delivered new materials. The outline grew taller and more complicated. From the battlements, the structure may first have looked like scaffolding or another ordinary engine. Gradually, its scale became unmistakable. The Warwolf attacked the imagination before it attacked the wall. Men who had endured hundreds of stones now had to ask what size of missile required such a frame. They had to picture the counterweight falling, the arm turning, and the sling opening. They had to decide whether courage meant remaining at their posts or preventing the destruction of the fortress they had sworn to defend. Its operation depended on gravity. The Warwolf contained no gunpowder and no motor in the modern sense. Its strength began with a long, throwing arm mounted across a heavy frame. The shorter end carried the counterweight. The longer end held a sling containing the projectile. To prepare the machine, workers used ropes and winches to pull the long arm downward, raising the counterweight. This required controlled effort. Men walked capstans or worked handles, drawing the mechanism into position while others checked the ropes and sling. Once the arm was lowered, a great stone could be placed securely. The machine was aimed not by turning a convenient wheel, but through its position, the arrangement of its base, the length of the sling, and the release mechanism. When the trigger was activated, gravity pulled the counterweight down. The short end of the arm descended, while the long end accelerated upward. The sling extended the movement, increasing the speed of the projectile before one end released. The stone then followed a curved path toward the castle. In a successful shot, the heavy counterweight fell only a limited distance, but the long arm and sling translated that movement into tremendous velocity. By the time the Warwolf neared completion, Oliphant understood that the siege had entered its final stage. The defenders had held for months, but no wall was invulnerable. Even if the first shot missed, the English could adjust and fire again. If a breach opened, Edward's soldiers could storm the damaged section. The garrison was too small to defend every point indefinitely. Continued resistance might achieve nothing except the deaths of the remaining men and the ruin of the fortress. Oliphant therefore offered to surrender. His decision was not necessarily cowardice. A commander was responsible not only for displaying courage, but also for recognizing when sacrifice no longer served a military purpose. The castle had delayed Edward. It had preserved a symbol of Scottish resistance longer than almost anyone expected. Now the symbol was about to be smashed by a machine designed specifically to make its destruction unforgettable. Edward's refusal changed the meaning of everything that followed. Had he accepted the surrender, the Warwolf might have remained an impressive unfinished threat. Its existence alone would have helped win the castle, but Edward wanted more than an efficient conclusion. He wanted proof. He wanted to see whether the weapon worked, and he wanted others to see it. A viewing gallery was prepared for ladies of the court, turning the attack into a royal spectacle. The exact thoughts of the witnesses are lost, but the arrangement reveals Edward's intention. This was not a desperate final effort required to save his army. The defenders had already yielded. The firing was political theater. The king would display his wealth, his engineers, his authority over Scottish resources, and his power to decide when surrender became valid. Mercy would not begin when Oliphant asked for it. Mercy would begin when Edward had finished his demonstration. For the men inside the castle, the refusal must have been devastating. They had accepted defeat in the hope of preserving lives and limiting destruction, yet the enemy would not permit them to escape the weapon they feared. They could only prepare. Some would have moved away from the section of wall most likely to be targeted. Others may have reinforced doors, cleared passages, protected water, or searched for shelter beneath the strongest surviving structures. No one knew precisely where the stone would land. The castle that had offered safety now became a confined target. Above the battlements, the Scottish flag remained visible. Below, workers readied the Warwolf. The day of the firing would have begun with inspection. The master carpenters checked the frame for movement and the ropes for damage. The sling was laid out. A stone weighing roughly 140 kilograms was prepared, a mass greater than that of many adult men and far beyond anything a human arm could throw. Teams took their positions at the winches. On command, they began to draw down the long arm. The work converted human effort into stored height as the counterweight slowly rose. Every turn increased the energy waiting within the machine. Men who had spent weeks building it now stood close enough to be killed if it failed. Soldiers cleared the dangerous area around the throwing arm and sling. Officials and spectators gathered where they could see without standing in the path of broken timber or a misreleased stone. Edward watched the machine created by his command. Far above, the defenders waited behind the wall. When the arm reached its loaded position, the stone was secured in the sling. The crew made final adjustments. Noise across the camp diminished as attention moved toward the engine. Horses shifted. Armor clicked. Wind crossed the open ground. The Warwolf stood motionless, but the raised counterweight made that stillness temporary. A final command was given. The trigger released. The counterweight dropped. The frame shuddered beneath the sudden force. The short end of the arm plunged as the long end swept upward. The sling dragged the stone forward, then snapped into the air. One loop slipped from the release pin at the calculated instant. The missile broke free. For a moment, the Warwolf had done all it could. Gravity, which had powered the engine, now pulled the stone towards Stirling Castle. The defenders may have seen it rising before it began to descend. A projectile of that size did not need an explosive charge to cause devastation. Its energy came from mass and speed. It crossed the space between the English camp and the Scottish wall, then struck the curtain masonry. The impact shattered part of the wall. Stone blocks cracked or shifted. Fragments burst inward. Dust rose and obscured the damaged section. The sound rolled across the rock and down into the camp. For the spectators, the shot proved that the machine worked. For the defenders, it proved that their decision to surrender had been correct. The weapon had passed from rumor to reality in seconds. Edward finally allowed the surrender to proceed. Oliphant and his men came out of the castle they had defended through months of bombardment. Their resistance did not earn a generous public conclusion. They were humiliated and sent to England as prisoners. The English entered Stirling and took control of the stronghold. Engineers and soldiers could inspect the breach while officials recorded the outcome. The Warwolf had achieved what Edward wanted, but not in the ordinary military sense. The castle had already surrendered before the shot. The machine's most important target was therefore not the curtain wall. Its true target was everyone who might hear the story. Robert the Bruce soon transformed that surviving idea into a new struggle. His position before 1306 had been complicated. He belonged to a family with its own claim to the Scottish throne, and had at different times opposed or cooperated with Edward. He was reportedly present during at least part of the Siege of Stirling and provided siege equipment to the English king. Whether watching the Warwolf directly shaped his later strategy cannot be proved, but he certainly understood the danger of allowing the enemy to occupy major fortresses. In 1306, Bruce killed his rival John Comyn at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, seized the political moment, and was crowned King of Scots. His rebellion began badly. He suffered defeats, went into hiding, and faced the destruction of his supporters. Edward prepared another campaign to crush him, but Edward IV was near the end of his life. In 1307, while traveling north with his army, the king died at Berg by sands near the Scottish border. The ruler who had commissioned the Warwolf did not live to see the final outcome of the conflict. His son, Edward II, inherited the crown, the war, and the expectation that English authority in Scotland could be maintained. He did not inherit his father's exact combination of discipline, political authority, and military reputation. Bruce rebuilt his cause through raids, alliances, surprise attacks, and the careful recovery of territory. Instead of always holding captured castles, his forces often dismantled them so that the English could not return and use the same strongholds as occupation bases. Walls that could protect Scotland could also protect an English garrison. Destruction became defensive strategy. Stirling again became central. By 1314, its English-held castle was under pressure from Bruce's forces. An agreement promised that the garrison would surrender if not relieved by a certain date, forcing Edward II to lead a major army north. Near Bannockburn, only a few miles from the fortress, Robert the Bruce confronted the English invasion. The resulting battle became one of the most famous Scottish victories in history. English cavalry struggled against disciplined Scottish formations in difficult ground. Edward II's army collapsed, and the king escaped. 10 years after the Warwolf shattered Stirling's wall, the castle's strategic importance drew another English king into a campaign, but this time the result strengthened Scottish independence rather than English conquest. The contrast is powerful. In 1304, Edward IV used an enormous machine to demonstrate that no Scottish fortress could resist his resources. In 1314, Robert the Bruce demonstrated that possession of fortresses did not guarantee control of a country. The Warwolf had been technically successful. It did exactly what a great trebuchet was designed to do. It transformed gravitational energy into a destructive strike. It damaged a curtain wall and terrified those who saw it. As an engineering achievement, it deserves admiration. Its builders solved difficult problems with wood, rope, iron, stone, experience, and coordinated labor. They created a weapon whose name survived for more than 7 centuries, even though the machine itself disappeared. But as an instrument intended to end Scottish resistance forever, it failed. A machine can destroy the material defenses of a political idea without destroying the idea itself. The builders themselves remain less famous than the ruler who commanded them. Edward did not personally shape every beam, twist every rope, or calculate every release. The Warwolf was a collective achievement produced by craftsmen whose knowledge rarely receives the same attention as the names of kings. Each successful shot depended on men who understood timber, tension, balance, weight, and timing. Laborers hauled materials, smiths forged fittings, rope makers supplied lines strong enough to survive the strain. Quarrymen or soldiers selected and shaped projectiles. Team leaders coordinated the loading process. Engineers observed the result. Even the power of a king required the hands and judgment of people whose names have largely vanished. The Warwolf therefore tells two stories at once. One is the story Edward wanted to tell, the story of a ruler whose command could break any wall. The other is the quieter story of medieval technology, in which practical knowledge moved through workshops, armies, and generations. It also reveals the strange boundary between war and entertainment. The viewing gallery prepared for ladies of the court did not make the danger less real. Men were still inside the target. Stone still shattered stone. Yet the royal audience turned violence into ceremony. The shot became a performance with a beginning, a climax, and witnesses chosen to remember it. Edward's court could watch the king's authority become visible through machinery. The Warwolf stood like a monument to command. Its builders waited for permission. Its crew moved at an order. Its counterweight fell because the king desired a demonstration. Even the surrendered defenders had to remain in danger until the performance was complete. This was power expressed not only through killing, but through control of time. Edward decided when the siege began, when the messenger could not leave, when surrender would be rejected, when the engine would fire, and when mercy would finally be permitted. The Warwolf was a masterpiece of medieval engineering and a weapon of calculated intimidation. It showed what skilled craftsmen could achieve when supplied by royal wealth and driven by military necessity. It also showed the cruelty of a ruler who valued demonstration above an offered surrender. Its stone shattered part of Stirling's curtain wall, but its greater purpose was to strike the imagination of Scotland. Edward wanted fear to travel farther than any projectile. He wanted the name of the Warwolf to enter every castle before his army arrived. Yet a wall is not a nation. A fortress is not an idea. And surrender at one moment is not obedience forever. The wolf had been released, the castle had fallen, and the king had staged his triumph. Still, beneath the dust of the broken masonry, the belief he hoped to destroy remained alive.